The train rolled west through a dry land stitched with dust and distance, and somewhere in the third passenger car, sitting alone near the window, was a woman who whispered to herself, not in madness, but in memory. Her name was Evelyn Hart, 51. Not young, not old, not polished, not ruined, but different, yes. Folks back east had called her odd, and they said it like it was a stain. She read books about herbs and dreams. She spoke slowly as if weighing every word for its soul. And when her sister's husband died, it was Evelyn who laid lavender on his chest, while others stood back uneasy. They never said thank you. They just said she gave them chills. So when her only family arranged a marriage out west, offered her as a practical woman with no demands, Evelyn packed her belongings in a wooden box wrapped in canvas. She tied her gray-streaked hair into a loose bun, and she boarded the train like a parcel, trusting a promise she hadn't written. But when she stepped off in Dalton Ridge, there was no one waiting. No man, no note. Only a boy with a cart who said, "Ma'am, you, the strange mail order lady, he left this for you." A crumpled letter, 3 lines. "You didn't mention she talked to plants? Or had those eyes? Too odd for me. Keep the deposit." And just like that, Evelyn Hart, who never begged, who never boasted, was left standing on a wooden platform with nothing but silence at her feet and 50 years of being misunderstood heavy in her chest. The townspeople passed with side glances. They didn't say she was crazy. They didn't need to. That night she slept near the livery, tucked beside the haystack with her canvas bundle under her arm, while the prairie wind whispered secrets only she seemed to hear. But Evelyn didn't cry. She lit a small oil lamp, took out a worn journal, and wrote "rejected but intact, humiliated but still whole." What they call strange, perhaps, is just sacred forgotten. Her breath made clouds in the cold, and the lamp kept flickering like it believed in her. She didn't know yet that someone had been watching from across the street, a quiet figure behind the stable doors with calloused hands and kind eyes, who did not laugh when she spoke to horses or murmured over roots. He didn't move, but he remembered her. The next morning, Evelyn Hart woke to hooves, not galloping, not threatening, just a steady rhythm, a gentle scrape of hay. The world hadn't changed, but the sun had moved a little closer, like it too was curious what she might do next. She rose from the straw, brushed off her skirts, and pressed a palm to her aching back. At 51, the body forgets softness if it's been without a bed too long. Still, she whispered a quiet thank you to the ground and made her way toward the well behind the stables. And that's when she saw him. He stood with a rope in one hand, a wooden yoke in the other. Broad shoulders, wide brim hat tipped low, and eyes hazel steady, a little sad. The kind of man who didn't waste words unless they had work to do. "Need water?" he asked, voice like creek, gravel rough but kind. She nodded. He lowered the bucket, drew it up, and handed it to her. Didn't blink at her gray streaks. Didn't stare at the stitched herbs poking from her bag. Just watched her drink with quiet reverence. Evelyn wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "You work the stables?" He nodded once. "Name's Caleb. Caleb Oakes. Been here since the war ended." And then before she could answer, he said something she hadn't expected. "I remember you. You talked to that colt 2 years ago when it wouldn't eat. You told it stories." Evelyn blinked. Few people remembered her by anything but insults. Fewer still remembered her kindness. "That colt recovered, didn't he?" He nodded again. "Wasn't the oats? Was the way you sat near him. Like he wasn't broken. Just waiting." She smiled softly. "Aren't we all?" There was a silence after that. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of stillness that happens when two souls aren't afraid of quiet. From behind the barn, a woman barked, "Caleb, stop jawing. The barrels won't load themselves." He gave Evelyn a look, not embarrassed but apologetic, then tipped his hat. "Stay warm, Miss Hart." He knew her name. That evening she found a folded wool blanket set gently atop her bundle. No note, but a single sprig of wild mint tucked into the corner. He had remembered her scent. For the first time in months, maybe years, Evelyn slept deeply. She dreamt not of escape but of belonging, of quiet hands, of horses who listened, of a man who watched from a distance, not out of judgment, but because he saw her, and maybe, just maybe, had been waiting too. What happens when two quiet hearts begin to hear each other again? The prairie had a way of echoing back things you didn't mean to say, not with sound, but with feeling. Evelyn learned this as she settled into the quiet guest house that Caleb offered her, a small cedar cabin beside the barn. He didn't ask for her past. He didn't demand her story. But stories have a way of seeping into cracked wood floors, into the folds of blankets, into the silence between two people who are slowly, cautiously becoming less alone. Evelyn tried to be helpful. She swept, stitched, fed the chickens, and took care not to speak too much. Years of ridicule had taught her that her voice too offbeat, too serious, too bookish was often met with laughter or worse, silence. But one evening as they shelled beans by lantern light, she murmured, "You know, Caleb, most men say I talk too slow or think too much." He paused, a bean half open in his rough palm. "Then they've never listened to a river," he said. And just like that, she felt something split, not in pain, but in surprise. Still doubts crept in like nightfall. Who was she to deserve this calm? Was he only being kind? Would this too be taken? One afternoon she overheard the townsfolk whisper, "That's the woman who reads to animals. She's the one who tried to start a garden on dry stone. Bless her heart, but she ain't right." It stung. Old wounds opened with new precision. That ache, the kind that starts in the chest, but spreads like frost to the fingertips, returned. That night she didn't come to supper. She sat on the porch instead, watching the sky forget itself in hues of rose and ash. And Caleb, quiet as ever, placed a plate next to her elbow without a word. Not pushing, just present. Then softly, "They said I was strange too after Ruth died. Keeps to himself. Talks to horses. But I reckon strange folk are just those who feel things a little longer." Evelyn looked at him. Really looked. And in his eyes she saw something that scared her more than ridicule, understanding. Because to be understood meant risking being loved. And to be loved meant risking losing it again. But what if love this time wasn't a storm to endure, but a shelter to return to? There comes a day, sometimes quiet and sometimes loud, when a woman who has kept herself folded too long decides to stretch. Not in rebellion, not in defiance, but in remembrance that she too was once sunlight. For Evelyn, that day came on a Thursday, right after a prairie storm passed through. The chickens were scattered, the fence had collapsed, the cellar door had blown clean off. Caleb was still in town and the ranch was, for a moment, hers alone. She didn't hesitate. She pulled on her boots, grabbed a hammer that still felt unfamiliar in her palm, and got to work. First the fence, then the cellar door. Then, noticing the sheep uneasy in the distance, she fixed the latch on the gate too. By the time Caleb returned, she was mud-streaked and breathing hard, but standing straighter than ever. "You patched that fence better than I ever could," he said, surprised. Evelyn laughed, that rare, soft chuckle that sounded like a wind chime in a forgotten window. "I've been fixing things my whole life," she said. "Just never my own." Caleb looked at her with something new in his gaze. Not pity, not surprise, but pride. That night over stew and silence, he slid a small book across the table. Her old journal. She thought it had blown away in the wind. Inside was a note written in careful script. "The strange things you carry are the reasons I want to stay." It wasn't a love confession. It was something deeper, an acknowledgement, a promise without noise. And for the first time in years, Evelyn allowed herself to cry, not from pain, but from the release of a lifetime of holding it all in. She cried like the land after drought, softly, gratefully. Later that week, she started her garden again, not to prove a point, but to belong. She chose the rocky patch again, but this time not alone. Caleb helped her dig, and when neighbors passed by and stared, she smiled back. Not to challenge them, not to shrink, but to say, "I'm still here, and I am no longer hiding." What happens when a woman no longer apologizes for her presence, but lives like she was meant to be seen all along? The garden grew crooked and stubborn, just like her. Beets wild, mint peas curling around string, and Evelyn in her patched dress humming soft hymns from her childhood, while the sun crept down the far hills. The land had stopped resisting her hands. The soil, once hard and suspicious, softened under her care. But even blooming fields can tremble beneath thunder. It started when a rider came up the lane. Not Caleb, not a neighbor, a man from her past, Raymond Holt, the one who once called her unfit for company, the one who paid her fare west and left her standing with nothing but her hands and a bag of dried rose petals. Now he was here wearing a new coat, pretending time had made him noble. "I heard you were still alive," he said like it was a question. Evelyn stood still. Wind picked at her skirts. "And I heard you were still married to yourself." He smirked, but the laugh didn't reach his eyes. "You think you're something now, living here like some frontier matron?" She didn't flinch. "Not this time. I don't think I'm something. I know I am. And you don't get to name me anymore." He spat near her tomatoes, looked around the land like it owed him, then said, "I made you. Don't forget that." Caleb was watching from the porch. Not a word, but his hand gripped the rail. Later that night, she told Caleb everything about the ad, the rejection, the shame the letters never answered. Caleb listened. And when she was done, he said simply, "You weren't made by the men who left you, Evelyn. You were shaped by how you stayed kind after." It wasn't a grand declaration, but it shook something deep in her like truth ringing inside an old bell tower. That night she sat with her journal again. She wrote just 5 words, "I am not what they named," then tore out the page and let the wind carry it. She wasn't running anymore, but she wasn't done facing things either, because sometimes healing isn't just gentle, it's fierce. And in the heart of quiet lands, even a soft woman can roar. What happens when the names once used to shame us become echoes instead of anchors? The next Sunday, Evelyn walked down into town, not for market, not for sewing circle, but for the town meeting held in the little wooden church that doubled as courthouse, chapel, and social hall. She wore her same dress, no frills, no corset, but she carried herself as if it were velvet. The whispers began before she opened the door. "That's the odd one. Used to be a mail-order bride, wasn't she? Lives with the quiet man out past Cedar Ridge." Inside, the benches creaked as she walked the aisle alone. Caleb was already seated at the back, his hat in his lap. Their eyes met, his steady, hers resolute. Mayor Wicks was announcing new town rules about land allotments and settlement claims. It was technical dull, but Evelyn stood. People turned. Some rolled their eyes. "I have something to say," she said, her voice not loud, but it carried. "I was sent here in a lie, bought for a promise that never came. Called strange, fat, not worth writing back to. They sent me like a crate of dried fruit, cheap, shelf-stable, and forgettable." Murmurs. "But I planted food in dead soil. I helped neighbors birth babies and bury mothers. I've prayed for your sick when you wouldn't touch my hand. And I've kept my dignity when some of you tried to take it." Silence. "I don't need your permission to belong here. I already do." Someone stood. It was Widow Hart. "She's right," the woman said, trembling. "I was one of those who mocked her. But she brought soup when my Joseph was dying. Didn't even knock. Just left it hot on the porch." And then a man stood. Then another. One by one, people saw Evelyn not for what she had been called, but for what she had quietly done. Caleb rose last, walked down the aisle. Not to protect her, but to stand beside her. "Name her what you want," he said, voice steady, "but I call her mine." And for the first time in years, Evelyn smiled, not the soft one she gave to babies and wildflowers, but a smile full of defiance and peace. She had not just survived the West, she had claimed it. What happens when a woman who was once traded for silence finds her voice and uses it? Winter came early that year, the kind that turned fences to bone-white lines and made horses steam like kettles. But inside Caleb's cabin, the fire was steady, the kettle always warm, and there was laughter low and real. Evelyn had moved in without ceremony. No wedding bells, no preacher's words, just a quiet decision like most real love begins. She stitched curtains from scraps. She brewed tea from dried lavender she'd grown in a clay pot by the window. And in the evenings, she read to Caleb, not to teach, not to impress, just to sit beside him and share the quiet. He had built a bench on the porch. 2 seats, one worn down for her, one wide enough for a guest. "You never know who needs sitting space," he'd said. And one day someone did. A girl, 14, barefoot, holding a letter. "I heard you take in people folks don't want," she mumbled. "I don't talk much, but I'm good at tending goats." Evelyn looked at her, saw herself years younger, heart half closed. She stepped aside. There's always room, she said and smiled. Some folks say Evelyn was strange to the end, that she brewed tonics with too many herbs and knew when people were lying by the way their eyelids twitched. But those who lived near her, who sat on that porch and drank her tea, said she carried something this land had forgotten, a slowness, a steadiness, and the kind of love that doesn't shout but stays. Sometimes the most powerful kind of love isn't loud or sudden, it's the kind that grows in silence over time. That's what Evelyn found. Not a fairy tale, but a steady home. Not someone who saved her, but someone who saw her. She was once cast aside, called too much, too fat, too strange, too different. But in the quiet and the kindness of a man who had suffered his own storms, she found shelter. Together they built something simple, something soft, something strong. And maybe that's the lesson for all of us, that dignity doesn't depend on how others see us. It lives in how we carry ourselves when no one's clapping. And real love comes when someone says you just as you are enough. If this story touched a quiet place in you, neighbor, if it reminded you of someone you once were or someone you still hope to become, then let's keep telling stories like this together. Leave us a comment. Would you like to hear more stories like Evelyn's? Have you ever felt like you were too late and still found a kind of home? Don't forget to subscribe to None, Wild West Saga. Share this story with someone who might need to hear it today. There's always time for love and always room on the porch. See you in the next story.